Hello, YouTube friends, and welcome to another video. The last video I uploaded, I used what I call God's family tree to talk about the story of Joseph. And what I said I was going to do with the next video, which is this video, is fill it in because this goes from basically Abraham through Jesus. But there's a whole bunch of stuff that happened over here, and that's where we're going to start today's video. And so this is the first part of God's family tree. We know that God created the earth, and on the sixth day, he ultimately created man. And so we know that the first man was Adam, and then God put him to sleep and then removed his rib and then formed Eve. We also know that Adam and Eve sinned and they were kicked out of the garden. And once they were on the earth as we know it today, or something similar as we know today, they began to have children. First one was Cain, and I'm not going to go over his descendants, but if you want to review them, you can go to Genesis 4:17 through 22, and it lists Cain's descendants. We have Abel, who was murdered by Cain. It's really sad because there were basically four people on the earth: Adam and Eve, Cain, and Abel, and there was a vicious murder over some fruit. But be that as it may, ultimately, because Abel died, they were able to have another kid, Seth, and that's where I'm going to finish or continue God's family tree. Now, before I go any further, Genesis 5:4 said that Adam lived for about 800 years, and they had many other sons and daughters. But I'm only going to talk about Seth because it's pertinent to what I want to talk about today. And so Adam and Eve had Seth, and then Seth had Enosh. And whenever there's an arrow, it means basically a direct descendant. And so that means that Enosh was the son of Seth. But then many generations, many years, hundreds of years, if you will, passed between Enosh and Methuselah. And Methuselah is credited being the oldest man on earth. He lived 969 years, I do believe. And then still many hundreds of years passed. And then eventually Noah came into being. And Noah had three sons, because we know that Noah is associated with the flood. And one of my next videos, I'll talk about Noah, and I will sort of go over how the earth was repopulated after the flood. So Noah had three sons: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And if I'm pronouncing those names, please forgive me. And then Shem had several sons, and basically Shem is the father of the region that we know as the Middle East. And then Ham had several sons, and Ham is the father of the region that we know of today as Africa. And then finally, Japheth, he had many sons, and he is the father of the region that we know today of or as Europe. And I'm getting this from Unger's Bible Dictionary. I use this a lot. I think it's a great resource, and it just helps me understand the Bible more. And so this is important because I'm going to basically be talking about the line of Abraham. And so we know that Shem is the father of what we now know as the Middle East, and basically the Jews. And eventually Terah was born, and he was the father of Abraham. And now I'm going to go back to the chart that I went over the last video. So here is Terah. Terah had three sons: Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. And so, of course, Abraham, he was married to Sarah, but in the beginning they couldn't have kids, and they were a bit impatient. And so Sarah suggested that Abraham take his maidservant Hagar, and ultimately he had Ishmael, and then their descendants that go off, which I'm not talking about in today's video, perhaps in another video I will, but we know that Abraham eventually had Isaac, and Isaac married Rebekah. And going back to this tree, Terah had Nahor, who had Bethulah, who was the daughter, or rather the father of Rebekah. And so basically Isaac married his great uncle's daughter. They did that back then. And in a later video, I'll talk about intermarrying and then when God said to stop it. And then, of course, Isaac had Jacob. He also had Esau, and Esau had other descendants, which I'm not talking about, but they would go off of this page. And then Jacob had two wives, Leah and Rachel, and each one had a maidservant. And then Jacob started having kids. And in birth order, we had Reuben, Simon, Levi, Judah, and this is from Leah. And then eventually, Leah had two more kids, Issachar and Zebulun. And the descendants go out. And so we know that Levi is a descendant, or is like the great grandfather of Moses. And then Samuel, Ezra, Zechariah, or rather Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Zechariah, Ezra, and then John the Baptist. And so this line, Levi, they are the priestly descendants. And so after the fall, they did make it through to what we now know as the New Testament, because John the Baptist was basically a Levi, and that is Luke 1-5. And then we also talked about the last video, Judah, who, after going through some soul searching and becoming saved, is the father of, and I say father, not the direct descendant, but like the great grandfather of David, and moving on to Jesus. And then the other children, we have Bilhah, that's the maidservant of Leah. She had two kids, Dan and Nefertilia, and one of the more famous descendants of Dan is Samson, and he was a judge. This is Judges 13:2-24, and he lived around 1050 BC. And then we have Zilpah, another maidservant, Gad and Asher, not any famous, for lack of a better word, descendants that I could find. And then, of course, Rachel had two children, Joseph, and we went over that the last lesson, and then Benjamin, who ultimately did make it through, or his line did make it through after the fall to the New Testament. And we have some famous Benjamites, King Saul, the very first king of Jerusalem, Esther, which I will also talk about in a later video, and then the Apostle Paul. He probably says in Philippi 3:5 that I am a descendant of Benjamin. And so we also have some other kids of Terah, Haran, and he had Lot, and Lot left Sodom and Gomorrah, and basically his two children, his two daughters, didn't have any kids, and so they got him drunk and they lay with him, and they had two sons, Moab and Ben-Ammi, which I will also talk in another video. And then Ham, this goes off of the chart because that was one of the children of Noah, who ultimately was a descendant of the Canaanites. And so we have Rahab, who was a prostitute living in Canaan during the time of Jericho. And so ultimately, this chart just shows how Adam and Eve started off just with a couple of kids, and then they had many kids, and then it just moves on to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then we can just see how the world was formed. Of course, Judah, as I spoke about during the last lesson, ultimately was called the line, and Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. Now, a couple of points that I want to bring out with this short video. One, we are all God's children. Today, and even back in the day, racism always exists. People always disliked or didn't think that another group of people was good enough simply because they were of a different race. And that still happens today. And I venture to believe that it will continue to happen until Jesus comes back. But it's important to know that we are all God's children. We all came from Adam and Eve. We all came from Noah or one of his three sons. And so it would be nice if we could just realize that and get along. And unfortunately, that probably won't happen for quite some time until the Lord comes back. But I just want to say that we're all God's children. It doesn't matter if we're Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, we all are God's children. And the next thing that I want to say is that God can use you. And I want to go back because traditionally, the birthright was given to the first son. And so we know Judah was considered the line of Judah and ultimately in the line of Jesus. But he had three brothers before him. And so how is it that Judah became the one who was the line of Judah and basically in the descendant or in the line of Jesus. Well, that's because Reuben and Simon, as well as Levi, they messed up. And so I'm not going to go too heavily into it, but Reuben and Simon basically had relationships with one of Jacob's maidservants. And there was also some deception going on. There was a treaty, and ultimately there was some murders that took place. And so because the first three sons messed up, the birthright fell upon Judah, who was the fourth son. And so no matter who you are, God can use you. And also, let me go back here to Ham, the descendant Rahab. She was a prostitute. And so you would think, well, how in the world is a prostitute important? Well, because she obeyed God, as well as Ruth. Ruth was a Moabite. And I will talk about this because Ruth is one of my favorite books of the Bible because she obeyed God. Both Rahab, who was a prostitute, and Ruth, who was a Moabitess woman, ultimately are in the line of David. And we know, of course, David was the second king of Jerusalem and credited as the greatest king of Jerusalem, and ultimately is in the line of Jesus. So no matter who you are, God can use you. And so this was a very short video. I hope that you enjoyed it. The next video that I'm going to do will talk about Noah and just how after the flood, the earth was repopulated. So thank you very much for listening. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share.